So picking up where we left off with sine and cosine graphs, we did some different things with showing how the sine and cosine graphs were affected by some different things involving the y-coordinate. So that is by vertically stretching and shrinking, and that's also by vertically shifting either up or down. So what we're going to look at next is some different things that affect the sine and cosine graph horizontally speaking. So that can be through a horizontal stretch or shrink, which involves what's known as the period, and that can also involve some horizontal stretching, which is known as phase shift. So for example 6, the first part of this, we have y equals the sine of 2x. So what I'm going to do here with this is I'm going to make an xy table again, just like we did with the previous problems here. So I have for my x values, and these are the critical values, I have 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And my y values I have for sine 0, 1, 0, negative 1, and 0. So when I put a 2 inside the function here, when I put a 2 in front of that x, what that's going to do to my graph is it's going to take it and it's going to horizontally shrink it. So because my graph is shrinking horizontally, that's going to have an impact on the x-coordinates of the critical values. So mathematically, what I want to do to these x values here is I want to take each one of them and I want to divide it by 2. And I'm dividing it by 2 because the graph is shrinking. So these x values are getting closer together. So the division part of this is going to sort of take care of that. So when I do 0 divided by 2, I get 0. Pi over 2 divided by 2 is pi over 4. Pi over 2, or pi divided by 2 is just pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 divided by 2 is 3 pi over 4. And then finally 2 pi divided by 2 is just pi. So those are the values that I get. So now when I go to make the graph here, okay, I have my x values. So I have 0, I have pi over 4, I have pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and pi. And then finally I have the y values, which are going to go from 1 to negative 1. So my first point here is at 0, 0. The next point is at pi over 4, positive 1. Then I have pi over 2 and 0, 3 pi over 4, negative 1, and then pi and 0. And here's the curve that I have that connects those points. So remember your arrows at the end on the left side, since the graph's pointing in a downwards direction, I want to have that there. And on the right side, I want to have that arrow pointing in an upwards direction. So that's what the graph for part A looks like here. Part B, when I have y equals the cosine of x over 2, I can rewrite this as the cosine of 1/2 x. And that's going to help me because now when I put a 1/2 in front of the x, what that's going to do to the graph is it's going to horizontally stretch it. So I'm going to take my critical values for cosine, which are 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. I'm going to take my y values for cosine, which are 1, 0, negative 1, 0, and 1. So what I want to do here is I'm going to take this value that's in front of x, just like we did with the previous example, and I'm going to divide everything by 1/2. So just keep in mind, mathematically speaking, that when you divide by 1/2, that's the same as multiplying by 2. So when I do 0 divided by 1/2, that's 0. Pi over 2 divided by 1/2 is pi. Pi divided by 1/2 is 2 pi. 3 pi over 2 divided by 1/2 is 3 pi. And finally, 2 pi divided by 1/2 is 4 pi. So there's the table of values that I get for the graph. Now, I'm going to sort of make my graph here. So I got my x values. So I have 0, I have pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, and 4 pi. And here's my y-axis, 1 and negative 1. So my first point here is 0, 1, that's up here. Then I have pi and 0. Then I have 2 pi and negative 1. then I have 3 pi and 0, and then finally 4 pi and positive 1. So here's the curve that connects those points. So once again, remember your arrows for cosine. I want my ends to point like this here. So that's what the graph for part B looks like here. So that's just some different things involved with the horizontal stretching and shrinking of the graph. The next example gets into some different things with shifting. So when you have this for part A, x plus pi over 2, remember adding shifts the graph to the left. So when I go to do my critical values here, so I'm going to put my original ones in here. So I have 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. My y values for sine would be 0, 1, 0, negative 1, and 0. So because I have this here, this x plus pi over 2, and that's going to shift the graph to the left, what I want to do mathematically to shift everything to the left is I want to subtract by pi over 2. So every point here gets subtracted by pi over 2, and the reason I'm subtracting is because adding in the parentheses shifts the graph to the left. And by shifting to the left, I want to take each of these coordinates and subtract. So when I do that, I got 0 minus pi over 2, that's negative pi over 2. Pi over 2 minus pi over 2 is 0. Pi minus pi over 2 is pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 minus pi over 2 is pi. And 2 pi minus pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. So now when I go to make the graph for this, so there's my table of values. So I'm going to leave myself a little bit of space on this negative side here, because my first x value is negative pi over 2. Then I have 0 here in the middle. And then I got pi over 2, pi, and finally 3 pi over 2. And then here's my y-axis. So my first point is negative pi over 2, 0. That's here. And then I have 0, 1. And then pi over 2, 0. Pi, negative 1. And then finally 3 pi over 2, 0. So when I go to do this now, there's my curve. So once again, my arrows on the end for sine. To the left, this is going to point down. To the right, this is going to point up. So that's my graph for part A. For part B, I got the same kind of thing here. So with cosine of x minus pi over 4, what I'm going to have here is my table of values. So for cosine, my originals are 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And so for my y's, I have 1, 0, negative 1, 0, and 1. So since it's x minus pi over 4, remember subtracting shifts the graph to the right. So mathematically speaking, if I'm going to shift to the right, I want to add pi over 4 to each one of these x values. So I got this here. So when I add these up, so this first one here, 0 plus pi over 4 is going to be pi over 4. Pi over 2 plus pi over 4, that's 3 pi over 4. Pi plus pi over 4 is 5 pi over 4. 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 4, that's 7 pi over 4. And then finally 2 pi plus pi over 4 is 9 pi over 4. So that's my table of values. Now I'm going to make my graph here. So when I go to this, so here's my graph. So I have my x values, which are pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, and finally 9 pi over 4. And then here's my y values, 1 and negative 1. So my first point here is pi over 4 and 1, that's here. Then I have 3 pi over 4, 0. Then 5 pi over 4, negative 1. 7 pi over 4 and 0. And then 9 pi over 4 and positive 1. So here's my graph for that. So once again, remember your arrows. For cosine on the left, this is going to point down. Right will also point down like that there. So that's what my graph for part B looks like. So for the next example here, example 8, I'm going to basically take the two concepts that we just looked at with the x values. I'm going to kind of roll it into one thing. So I'm not only going to do some horizontal stretching and shrinking, but I'm also going to do some horizontal shifting as well. So with this here, I'm going to give myself a lot of room because I'm going to need a lot of room here. So I have my sine values first. So my originals are 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And then my y values for sine are 0, 1, 0, -1, and 0. So notice there's two things happening within this equation here. So this 2 in front of the parentheses is telling me that the graph is going to do a horizontal shrink, and then this plus pi over 2 in the parentheses is telling me that the graph is also going to shift to the left pi over 2. So mathematically speaking, always deal with the stretching and shrinking part before you deal with the shifting. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take each of my x values, I'm going to divide them by 2. Then, because this is shifting to the left, I'm then going to subtract by pi over 2 after that. So always deal with your stretching and shrinking first. Just like when we were talking vertically speaking, you did the same thing, we're going to do the same thing here. So when I do this, I have 0 divided by 2 is 0, minus pi over 2 is negative pi over 2. Here I have pi over 2 divided by 2 is pi over 4, minus pi over 2 is negative pi over 4. Next I have pi divided by 2 is pi over 2, minus pi over 2 is 0. Here I have 3 pi over 2 divided by 2 is 3 pi over 4, minus pi over 2 is pi over 4. And then finally 2 pi divided by 2 is pi, minus pi over 2 would be pi over 2. So there's the table of values that you get. Now I can start to make the graph. So once again, I'm going to leave myself a little bit of extra space on the negative side of the x-axis here so I can fill these points in. So I got negative pi over 2, negative pi over 4, 0 in the middle, pi over 4, and pi over 2. So my points, I have and then here's my y-axis, 1, -1. So I first point here is negative pi over 2, 0, that goes here. Then I have negative pi over 4, -1, that's going to be here. Then I have 0, 0, and then pi over 4, -1 is here. And then finally pi over 2, 0 is going to be here. So here's my graph. So I get something that kind of looks like this here. So just keep in mind for your sine graph, as far as the arrows on the end, you know, the next point for this here is going to be kind of up this way, and then the same thing kind of going like that there. So that's what my graph for that part there is going to look like. So with, whoops, I think I might have drawn my curves wrong. Let me kind of come back to these points again. Looking at my curve, that doesn't look right. Let me sort of get my points here, sort of erase these. So let me get my pen back up here. Something doesn't look right with that. So let me draw my axis again and replot these points. So I got negative pi over 2, 0, that's here. Negative pi over 4, +1, there we go, that's better. Then I got 0, 0, pi over 4, -1, and 0, pi over 2, 0. So here's my graph, that looks better. So down here, this one's going to point down, this one's going to point up. That's a better looking graph. So that's part A. For part B, I got y equals cosine of 1/2 times x minus pi. So same sort of thing here, but now we're talking cosine. So once again, just give myself a lot of room here. So my original critical values for cosine, 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And then for my y's, I have 1, 0, negative 1, 0, and 1. So when I go to do the equation here, if you notice, I have this 1/2 in front of the parentheses. So that's telling me that this graph is going to have a horizontal stretch, and then this minus pi in the parentheses tells me that the graph is going to shift pi units to the right. So remember, always deal with your stretching and shrinking first. So I'm going to take each of these x values, I'm going to divide it by 1/2, which remember is the same as multiplying by 2. Then I'm going to add pi to that result at the end. So remember, I'm adding because when it's minus in the parentheses, that's telling me that the graph is shifting to the right, and mathematically speaking, to shift to the right, I have to add. So when I work this out, 0 divided by 1/2 is 0, plus pi is pi. Pi over 2 divided by 1/2 is pi, plus pi would be 2 pi. Pi divided by 1/2 is 2 pi, plus pi would be 3 pi. 3 pi over 2 divided by 1/2 is 3 pi, plus pi would be 4 pi. And then finally, 2 pi divided by 1/2 is 4 pi, plus pi would be 5 pi. So those are the x values that I get there. Now I can make my graph. So here's my x and y axis. So I have for here, I have pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, and finally 5 pi. So I have 1, negative 1 here. So when I plot my points, I got pi 1, that's here. Then I have 2 pi 0, that's here. 3 pi negative 1 would be here. 4 pi 0 would be here. And then finally 5 pi positive 1 would go here. So here's my graph. Here's my curve. So for cosine on the left, I'm going to have my arrows pointing down. Same thing on the right, arrows are going to point down. So one of the things just to kind of notice about parts A and B here is that the value of B was outside the parentheses. So notice this right here, that 1/2 was outside the parentheses. The 2 here for part A was outside the parentheses. In order to get the correct phase shift for a graph, then that B value needs to be outside the parentheses. But sometimes you get something like part C here, where the value of B is inside the parentheses. So whenever that occurs, what you need to do is you need to factor that number that's in front of x, you need to factor that out of the parentheses before you start to do your tables. So I'm going to take this here. So I'm going to have this as y equals the sine of 2, and then I'm going to take the 2 out, and when I do that, this turns into x minus pi over 6. So this becomes pi over 6 because if I take pi over 3 and I divide it by 2, this is what I get here, pi over 6. So now I can start to do my tables. So my original sine value, 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And then the y values I have for sine, 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. So what I want to do with this 2 that's outside the parentheses here is I want to take each of my x values and I'm going to divide by 2. So I'm going to take each of these, I'm going to divide by 2. Then, because I have minus pi over 6 in the parentheses, so remember, subtracting in the parentheses moves everything to the right. So mathematically speaking, I want to add pi over 6 to the end here. So when I go to do the math here, 0 divided by 2 is 0, plus pi over 6 would be pi over 6. Pi over 2 divided by pi over 2 is pi over 4, and pi over 4 plus pi over 6 is 5 pi over 12. Pi divided by 2 is pi over 2 plus pi over 6 would be 2 pi over 3. 3 pi over 2 divided by 2 is 3 pi over 4, and 3 pi over 4 plus pi over 6 is 11 pi over 12. Whoops, let me erase that. So this would be 11 pi over 12. And then finally, here I have 2 pi divided by 2 is pi, plus pi over 6 would be 7 pi over 6. So now I have my tables, now I can make my graph. So when I do this here, so I have pi over 6, 5 pi over 12, 2 pi over 3, 11 pi over 12, and finally 7 pi over 6. So for my points here, first I have pi over 6 and 0. So let me do my axis here. So that's going to go here. Then I have 5 pi over 12 and positive 1. That's going to go there. Then I have 2 pi over 3, 0. That's going to be here. Then I have 11 pi over 12 and negative 1. That's going to go here. And then finally 7 pi over 6 and 0. That's going to go here. And here's my curve that connects those points. So as far as my arrows go, I have this on the end here, and I have this on the end here. So that's what part C looks like. And then for part D, notice the same kind of thing here. The B value is inside the parentheses. So before I go to do anything with my x values with this, I want to factor that 1/2 out. So this is going to be y equals the cosine of 1/2, and this will be x minus 2 pi. So remember, this becomes 2 pi because I'm basically taking this pi and dividing it by 1/2. And that's where this 2 pi comes from. So now that I do that, now I can start to do some different things with the x values here. So my critical values for cosine, 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. My y values, critical values for cosine are 1, 0, negative 1, 0, and 1. So notice I have this 1/2 here first. So that tells me that the graph is going to have a horizontal stretch. So I'm going to take each of my x values, I'm going to divide by 1/2. Then in the parentheses I have minus 2 pi. So remember, subtracting inside the parentheses shifts the graph to the right. So mathematically speaking, if I shift to the right, I want to add. So I'm going to add 2 pi to each of these results. So when I work these out here, I got 0 divided by 1/2 is 0, plus 2 pi is 2 pi. Then I have pi over 2 divided by 1/2 is pi, plus pi would be 3 pi. Then I have pi divided by 1/2 is 2 pi, plus 2 pi would be 4 pi. Then I have 3 pi over 2 divided by 1/2 is 3 pi, plus 2 pi would be 5 pi. And then finally I have 2 pi divided by 1/2 is 4 pi, plus 2 pi would be 6 pi. So that's the result that I get from each of those values there. So now what I want to do is make the graph. So I have this now. So I got 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, 5 pi, and 6 pi. And then here's my y-axis. So my first point is 2 pi, positive 1, that's up here. Then I have 3 pi, 0, that's going to go there. Then I have 4 pi, negative 1, that's going to go here. Then I have 5 pi, 0, that's going to go there. And then finally 6 pi and positive 1, that's going to go here. So the graph for this is going to look like this here. And then for cosine, I'm going to have on the left my arrow point down, on the right arrow also points down. So that's some different things that we do that in terms of stretching and shrinking and shifting that involves changing the x-coordinates. So we did some different things in the previous lesson with stretching and shrinking and shifting with the y-coordinates. This time we looked at some different things with the x-coordinates. What we're going to look at next is how to take each of those two different concepts that we had, the stretching and the shrinking and the shifting for both the x and y coordinates, and kind of roll those all into one equation.